Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of My Racing Life, the show where we learn a little bit more about characters from the racing industry as they pick out each episode 7 horses, a trainer and a jockey who have rather shaped their love for the sport of horse racing. It's time to introduce our latest guest via this description, a man from a young age who's been a sport lover and a keen footballer from very early doors. 1996, for a few years, became a horse racing odds compiler, switched to Sky Sports, eventually heading up their football coverage before transferring to ITV for the return of their racing on terrestrial television from the beginning of 2017. So Ed Chamberlin fairly swapped the likes of Jamie Carragher, Gary Neville for Ruby Walsh and AP McCoy. It was a bit of a transition, but one that no doubt you look back on pretty fondly.
Absolutely, yeah. It was by far the biggest challenge, Nick, I've had in my career, switching from football to racing. I mean, imagine for you to switch to do a football match tomorrow. It's a difficult one, but I've absolutely loved it. And as you say, working with Ruby and AP has definitely had me thinking back to my times with Messrs Carragher and Neville. It is different but similar at the same time.
Now, the very reason we're doing this show, obviously, over the last couple of months, we have had no racing. Of course, ITV haven't been broadcasting terrestrial stuff. We missed the Grand National all through April and May as we continue to hopefully work back towards racing. And I suppose what you've got just over your right shoulder there is a bit of a sneak peek as to how ITV will be broadcasting when we return.
Can you imagine if a few months ago you said to me you're going to be presenting a classic in your little spare room? I thought you were absolutely bonkers, but now it almost feels the norm. I spend a lot of time in here on various Zoom calls and all sorts. So they've done an incredible job in here, Nick. I've got that as my background, which you can see half of. That's the ITV background. And then to my left, I've got 2 big lights, 2 monitors, all sorts of wires and computers and contraptions, and most importantly, a camera. So when racing's set to go, I will be set to go with ITV. When that will be, we still don't know. We've got everything crossed for June the 1st, and let's hope that can happen. And then we'll be ready to go for Newmarket on the Friday. And that 3-day weekend, really, of top-class racing. But we've got everything crossed.
We'll be desperate to have it back. We'll be looking forward to having it back. But I suppose in terms of the broadcasting from home, we saw recently the Bundesliga returned on BT Sport. You saw some of their commentators, how they did it. It's being a bit accepted as the new norm, and I'm sure anyone would just want to have racing back, wouldn't they? Absolutely.
I think viewers will hopefully be a bit more forgiving as well. The old Wi-Fi will be under pressure. You don't get 4G in Hampshire, really. So if the Wi-Fi drops out over the next hour, please forgive me, and likewise when we're on. But again, the technology they've got now is backup and so on. And Francesca will be in her house, Jason Weaver in his house. But likewise, the gallery you've got working today, all our guys will be at home. The director, Paul McNamara, the director's assistant, the editor will all be at home to start with anyway. And then we're looking at potentially Royal Ascot to be our first, what we would call an OB, an outside broadcast. But we'll wait and see, and we will adhere to every possible safety protocol, both at the racetrack and at home, and racing will as well. And we wait to hear more about that next week, of course.
Now, that's all to come, hopefully. We look forward to the future, but this is a show about looking back. And when you were asked to do this and pick out 7 horses, 1 trainer and 1 jockey who have been there as part of your racing life so far, was it a difficult one? Did names instantly come to your mind?
Yeah, it was very quick, actually. Very quick. I've always had my absolute favourites, and I've made no secret of them on terrestrial television either. So the 7 horses, it was a long list. The challenge was getting it down to 7. The trainer picked himself, and the jockey, who we'll talk about, won't like the fact I've picked him, but he was a very straightforward one as well. And it's a really fun challenge. I've loved the series. I've watched all of them, I think. Particularly enjoyed Hoylesy, obviously, Simon Holt and John Parrott. You guys, honestly, I'm not just saying this, but you've kept us all entertained in this barren period. And this has been a really enjoyable show. I hope the next 50 minutes or so doesn't send people to total boredom and sleep, but we'll do our best.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, we'll look forward to talking about what you're going to be looking back on. But viewers will see as the show progresses over the next 50 minutes or so, as you said, there is one race that you really, really love that obviously has captured your imagination more than any other, and it's the Grand National. Why the Grand National so much?
Because that's what got me into racing, Nick. That was the one race that really got me from a very early age. And very quickly I developed to become the family sweepstake creator. And the 2 favourite sporting events for me have always been the Grand National and the FA Cup final. And I would honestly put, even though my background was all football and I can remember every football team getting off the coach. That was always the highlight of the year. But the Grand National beat that. I didn't miss a minute of the coverage. I didn't sleep the night before. I got more sleep on the night before Christmas as a kid than I did before the Grand National. You can ask any of my family. That's the honest truth. I absolutely loved it. And I loved the whole Des Lynam era, and I just loved the race. And that's what got me. So to think that I've now presented it, well, only 3 occasions, sadly, having missed this year, that's, that was a dream come true for me. And the biggest responsibility I've had in my television career, when you think that the biggest game I ever did in football would be Man United-Liverpool or Liverpool-Man United, wherever they were in the league. And that on Sky would get between 3.5 million people. I mean, the Grand National knocks that out of the park, doesn't it, in terms of numbers? And that's as nervous as I've ever been on that one for Arthur Grand National before we went on air.
Well, that's the thing. We are going to show a number of Grand Nationals from as early as the 1980s, the beginning of the 1980s, as recent as Tiger Roll in 2019 as well. With that in mind, are there a number that you had to sort of agonisingly miss out on because of the fact that there were only 7 horses to pick out on, and you spanned 4 decades of the National?
Oh, yeah, big time. I could have chosen any number. Can't believe I've missed out Seagram's Grand National, for example. That was one of the best days we ever had. We'll talk about it later, but I used to go always to the Canal Turn. You don't do it anymore, but that used to be the biggest party in town at the Canal Turn, and loved it. And more recent ones, there have been so many. Used to have a bit of luck in the Grand National, but how I've left out one for Arthur. My producer at ITV won't be very happy because that was obviously the BAFTA-winning show, but he hasn't made it. That's how tough the competition was. And Don't Push It was a Grand National where I was in floods of tears afterwards for obvious reasons, and that hasn't made it either. So the Grand National was a very tough selection process.
Let's get the ball rolling. And the first of Ed's magnificent 7 is a Grand National winner, and one of the most famous of them all Daniti.
Comes Senator McLacurry and 3-1. It's Daniti now being pressed by Royal Mail, and Spartan Missile is still finishing strongly. It's Daniti though as they come to the elbow. They've got over a furlong to run, and it's Daniti in the lead, but being pressed now by Spartan Missile. It's Daniti from Spartan Missile, and here comes John Thorne, 54-year-old John Thorne, putting in a storming finish. It's Daniti from Spartan Missile. Daniti is going to win it at the line. Daniti wins the National. Spartan Missile is second. Royal Mail is just third ahead of 3-1. Senator McLacurry is fifth.
Daniti, the story was magnificent, both human and equine, back in 1981. But Ed, when we look back at that now, and obviously it's one of the most celebrated races in history, you wouldn't have been very old at all, just a child, but why did Daniti's success back then resonate so much with you?
It makes you tingle, doesn't it, all these years later? I've watched that race a million times, and it just gets you every single time. And that was my first ever bet. My grandfather's the man who got me into racing, a man called Jock Burns, a fierce, proud Scot, who in my childhood was pretty much stuck in his chair, basically. He loved cider and racing. Those were his 2 passions. And every year he'd back the Scottish horses in the Grand National, and he'd back greys. And he got me hooked, basically. And to sum up his passions in life, my mother's 18th birthday present was a tote credit account. So that tells you everything you need to know. And he let me have, I can't remember what it was, probably 50p each way or £1 each way. And I had it on Spartan Missile. So watching that at the time, I was livid. I was cursing the jockey. I wasn't very pleased about Daniti. Little did I know that 54-year-old John Thorne, with that epic O'Sullivan commentary, was doing amazing things in the saddle. And we had unfolding in front of us one of the great sporting stories, not just racing, one of the great sporting stories with Daniti's comeback, but also Bob Champion. What a story that is. I'm sure everyone's seen Champions, the movie, and that obviously resonates with me because I had a similar journey and a similar story in many ways to Bob Champion with the illness. And I've really enjoyed getting in touch with Bob, and he spelt my name wrong in his book, but apart from that, I admire him enormously. And that was just one of the great races, and the race, the one race that got me totally hooked on racing, not just the Grand National.
Were you sports mad as a child then, at that point?
Oh, God, yeah. Bonkers. Absolute bonkers. And it's a very similar story with my children, because after the virtual Grand National, no word of a lie, immediately straight out in the garden, creating a Grand National circuit, just as I did, goodness knows how long ago. And they created a circuit, and I'll let you in on a secret. My son went on the inside of his big sister and went straight into a fence, and we thought he'd broken his arm during lockdown. So, yeah, we have had a trip to A&E during lockdown. It took a bit of explaining, to be fair, that they were doing a Grand National around our little garden. It would have taken 8 or 10 circuits, but he didn't even get round the first one. And I was exactly the same. And all I did all the time, cricket and football were my things, but golf, tennis, I tried my hand at everything. And yeah, absolutely sports bonkers I was, and probably still am, if truth be told.
And just going back to Aldenite, you mentioned it, of course, with Bob Champion. And I think Nick Gifford, the son of course, the late trainer Josh, he was only 9, and I read his recollections at the time, and he just said that it's almost like the race was the second fiddle. It was the fact that it created such awareness, the cancer awareness, the fact that the horse had... There were a couple of occasions when there were suggestions the horse should be put to sleep, and I suppose that's sometimes what sport can do. It offers a situation that you couldn't even envisage. It gives you the fairy tale, doesn't it?
Particularly that race. I mean, when's there been a Grand National without a story? And sport doesn't often follow the script, does it? But it's never followed a better script than that in 1981. And if you haven't watched it, youngsters watching this, watch the movie. Watch Champions over the next week or so before live racing comes back, because it's just epic. And the first thing I did, Nick, when I heard I had the job, was talk to the bosses at ITV about the Grand National. And I asked for one thing, and that's the return of the Champions music. That was just such a big part of my childhood, and I think it resonates with everybody, that famous, almost haunting music that starts a Grand National show.
And as a child, you talked about this being, obviously, through your grandfather, the bet. That's the thing about horse racing. There's so many different factors as to why people enjoy it, and I could name just a couple of the myriad factors, where there's the betting side of it, the animal side of it, the sport, the human interest as well. It brings all of that together. So from a sports broadcaster's perspective, is it quite an ideal sport in that respect?
Absolutely, 100%, because it's got so many different elements to it. And people often talk about racing coverage. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? Football do this, football do that. But you've got to remember, in football, you've got 90 minutes of action, and my half times used to be about 2.5 minutes of broadcasting when you take into account advertising. And you think how different racing is. You know, you've got half an hour between races and more, because a race can last, a minute and a half, often less on the flat. So you can see the challenge there is with that, but that also opens doors. I always say at ITV, particularly at the moment when we come back, let's not focus on what we can't do. Let's focus on what we can do, even broadcasting remotely. And racing's like that. It opens doors to tell great stories. I can't wait in the future, in the next few weeks, to tell the stories that racing have done during lockdown. Everything from Lara Telfer winning Furlong Factor for racing welfare, to Jamie Osborne's yard, to Sir Mark Prescott and Aidan O'Brien with the raw eggs, to everything that's going on and the good work that people, individuals and charities have done. And we will have the opportunity to tell those stories. And racing throws up incredible stories that are such fun to tell. And as a race, the race at Aintree does that better than anything else. And I've loved telling those stories.
Well, let's have a look at another Grand National a decade or so after Aldenite and the magnificent party politics.
To jump, Romany King is coming up on the outside of Party Politics by 2 lengths to Romany King. They're a long way clear of Docklands Express and Lara's Bro. They're going down towards the elbow, and it's Party Politics, the big horse. Here comes Romany King on the outside. They're well clear of Docklands Express. They come past the elbow, and it's Party Politics putting in a big run. It's Party Politics clear by 4. He's keeping up the gallop. Carl Llewellyn's going for everything, but it's going to be Party Politics National. They've got 100 yards to go, and it's Party Politics in the lead, striding resolutely up towards the line, and Party Politics is going to wake in. Party Politics, an election year, the winner from Romany King second, a big gap to Lara's Bow, and then back in 4th place came Docklands Express, followed by Just So and Twin Oaks and Old Applejack. And over the road,
the giant Party Politics, and what a topical winner as well, Ed. What, 5 days before the Kinnock versus Major general election as well. I bet he was backed into 14-1, and a very, very topical winner on the day. But why is he in your list of 7?
For a number of reasons, really. You have to love him. You just have to look at him to love him. He was a bit like Top Notch. You can't talk about Top Notch without saying the diminutive Top Notch. You couldn't talk about Party Politics, just like you did there, without saying the giant Party Politics. And he had this giant tube in his neck, and I just love big stamp of a chaser like that. And he had a lovely story behind him as well, and for Carl Llewellyn to take over from Andrew Adams. I mean, heartbreak really in many ways, but he was a gorgeous looking horse, And that, for me, was an important Grand National. Listen, I don't know what a good horse looks like. I never even pretend to. And when you talk about me getting into racing, it really was the betting side that got me involved. I still don't know a good-looking horse from an ugly one even now, but I always loved him just because of his size. And as I said earlier, I always used to go to the Grand National from the age of probably 15 upwards. And then when we passed our driving licence, the first one would have been Seagram. And then the following year, we had enough money. There was always a gang of 4 of us. We had enough money to go and watch from the stands. So Party Politics was my first Grand National actually watching from the stands. And that opened up a whole new challenge. Remember what I said about earlier, always enjoying the Grand National coverage and what Des Lynam did. He was my absolute hero in life, Des, even more than Steve Williams and other players at Southampton Football Club. And the challenge then quickly became to try and get on telly, believe it or not, pathetic as it sounds. So we would stand behind Des Lynam. Obviously, we didn't have mobile phones in those days, so you'd have set the video recorder at home and watched it a couple of days later. And we got on that year with him interviewing Jenny Pittman, as he did every year. And that felt like we climbed Everest. It was the most exciting thing ever. And then Party Politics, and we all backed one. And even though, as you heard in GG's commentary as well there, election year and all that kind of thing, 1992, if you look back, I can't remember what price he was on the tote, but he was much bigger than you'd expect. And I mean, he was 30-1 plus, if memory serves. So we got a very pleasant surprise when we went to the tote booth, because you'd never do that now, would you? A topical winner like that, bet necessarily on the tote. You try to go for a less topical one in election year. You wouldn't have backed Party Politics now in election year, but he paid a huge price on the tote. So add all that in, and it was a memorable, memorable year, and a wonderful horse who I can almost guarantee you, no guarantees in the National, of course, but if you speak to Carl Llewellyn, Nick, he says he was an absolute certainty the next year in the race that never was. And you watch it back and all the awful coverage of what happened, but he was swinging along around that first circuit, Party Politics. He made those fences look so small. And Carl always says he was in much better form in 93 than he was in 92. So that was the one that got away. But he's still a national legend, having won in 92.
I love, there was a banner, I think, unfurled when he got back to Lambourne. Never mind the politics, let's have a party, which I thought was quite nice, reading about that from some years ago. But in terms of you and your life,
Very good.
17, 18 at that point, what was your landscape like at the time? And presumably looking, a few years away from doing what you did, the odds compiling that we'll come to, but what was your sort of situation at that point, Ed?
So I was going to Exeter University to study politics, would you believe? With no desire to go into politics whatsoever. I went to Exeter purely because I was a member of St Enodoc Golf Club, which is an hour and 10 minutes away from the university. I'd never been there before in my life before I went to my first politics lecture. But it also meant I could go to every Wincanton, Newton Abbot and Exeter meeting there was. So it was the perfect place for me, really. And very quickly I knew I wanted to work in sport. And very quickly I realised I wanted to work in racing. So all 3 years really were geared to trying to find a way to get into that, which then came via what was the BHB in those days, in the mid-90s. And my application to the BHB to go on their graduate scheme, thankfully, was successful. And it went from there.
I just want to know as well, I said to you how easy was it to find these 7 horses and talk about the trainer and the jockey as well. Some of the people that we've had on the show have said, they naturally like to look forward. But are you quite a nostalgic person? And does it stir up emotion when you look back at things like that?
Oh, big time. I'm pathetic as well, by the way. I mean, really am. I mean, I cry at the drop of a hat. And I love nostalgia. And again, that's been a big part of what we do on ITV, because when you look at our average age of viewers, probably over 50, so you often want to play on that a bit and go down memory lane, and that's where our very own and your very own Richard Hoyles comes into play. I've sort of made him our historian, which I think's gone down well, and he's absolutely brilliant at it, as you know. So very rarely would there be an ITV show without a trip down memory lane or two, and of course that ITV archive is fantastic with all the shots of Russ Scott presenting and all that kind of thing. So that's good fun. But I also think people love it. And I absolutely love going down memory lane, which has been one of the upsides of the lockdown, really, in every sport. I've watched Ryder Cups. I've watched the old test matches. I watched the 2005 Edgbaston test match. I think I watched every day, most of it as well. And likewise, the World Cup final and that type thing. And for the old races, I can't get enough of it. I absolutely love them. And the stuff you've done as well, that when you went back and looked back at each year, I was addicted to that, and all the old races I've loved. And yeah, I think nostalgia is a big thing, not just for me.
Well, let's keep it going then. Horse number 3 in the list, one of the most popular horses around in the 1990s. His name, Dublin Flyer.
He didn't set a very strong pace early on. He's been keeping plenty up his sleeve, and now he's accelerating round the bend, trying to stretch clear, but Egypt Mill Prince is sticking to him. Big Matt is running on in third, and Gnomes Tycoon is hanging on in four, and Egypt Mill Prince just heads Dublin Flyer at the last. He gets a great jump out of him as well. He lands a length clear, and Egypt Mill Prince is coming up the run in now. Dublin Flyer is fighting back. This is going to answer the questions about Egypt Mill Prince's stamina, and Dublin Flyer is going to find it out as well. Inside the last 50 yards now, and Dublin Flyer fights back, goes past the fading Egypt Mill Prince. Big Matt runs on to take third, Gnomes Tycoon in four.
The winner of 14 of his 34 races, and it is fair to say, Dublin Flyer, talking about him, Ed, he really was one of the most popular horses around at that time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he captured lots of hearts, didn't he? I think it was his style of running, really, that people loved. To me, he's the one horse. I'm often asked for my favourite horse of all time, and I don't hesitate. I always say Dublin Flyer, because he exemplified everything great about National Hunt racing for me. He just loved his jumping. He jumped well that day, but you watch him around the Grand National fences. You showed the other day the John Hughes Memorial at the Grand National meeting. You watched that round of jumping over the big fences. It must have been so exhilarating for Brendan Powell. And I loved everything about him, the way he stuck his neck out. He looked beaten for all money by Egypt Mill Prince, didn't he, as they went up the hill. But then he sticks his neck out and fights back, and that says all about Dublin Flyer. But I loved everything else as well, the trainer who we'll talk about later. I loved how Brendan wore one of those old polar neck colours of John Sumner, the owner breeder. To me, Dublin Flyer had everything. He's actually behind me here. If you look at the picture just there, that's Dublin Flyer, and another horse we'll talk about in a minute, working in the snow at Downton in Captain Forster's days.
Tell us about you at this point. This is 1995. We were about to say that I think it was a year later you became a horse racing odds compiler. What's life shaping up like at that point, Ed?
Life is shaping up as if I'm going to get a terrible degree in politics. So I worked quite hard at that point and somehow managed to walk away with a 2-1. I still don't know how I managed that with the lifestyle I led then, because apart from when the fog came down on Halden Hill, I definitely didn't miss a meeting at Exeter. I went to most at Newton Abbot, and I used to go to Wincanton every Thursday because that's where my grandmother lived, who I talked about earlier, the grandfather who got me into it, who was long since dead by then, sadly. But my grandmother spoiled me rotten. So I knew if I went to Wincanton on a Thursday, I'd get a good lunch and I'd get at least 20 quid put in my pocket. So I went to Wincanton an awful lot as well. So at this point, I'd had a decent bet on Dublin Flyer. I can remember he went off at 4-1. I think he was 4-1 joint favourite in the Mackerson that day. I remember it so well. And I was preparing to try and get as good a degree as I could. And then with that ambition, as I said, to get into racing. So I was an impoverished student at that point. He's
a super jumper. You had a very generous grandmother, by the way. 20 quid sounds pretty good. But in terms of the jumping, Dublin Flyer was a magnificent jumper.
Oh, yeah.
Dublin Flyer was a magnificent jumper. There's a lot of jumps horses in this list. We know jumps racing is very much your passion. What is it about jumps racing that you think you love the most?
To be honest, since I've taken this job, I've started to grow a love for the flat even more, if I'm honest. But when you're brought up in the West Country, it's jump racing in people's blood down there. And if I'm brutally honest at this point, I didn't have a whole deal of interest in the flat. I think I'm right in saying before I broadcast Royal Ascot, I'm not even sure I'd been there before, let alone done something like that. So I was very much a National Hunt fan. Jumping was what I loved. We went to Wincanton all the time as a family, every Boxing Day. And I love the people, I love the horses, I love the stories. And any youngster, you implore them to go racing. Go racing with your family. And I absolutely guarantee if you stand by the second last at any racecourse, for me on Boxing Day, it would be the third last at Wincanton, because we used to do it on the cheap in the picnic area, a bit like a point-to-point. But if you stand by one of those fences as a youngster, I'd be amazed if anyone's not hooked by this great sport. Magnificent animals, jumping at speed, can't beat it.
The trainer of Dublin Flyer, of course, would concur with that, Captain Tim Forster, who will come to as you picked out as your trainer, who's rather illuminated your life in racing. But he was all about his chasers. He didn't like hurdlers necessarily, and he certainly didn't like the flat. At that point, was he quite a hero to you? Because we're going to come to another of his horses in a moment or two's time.
Absolutely. And I never met him. But I just loved everything he believed in terms of his love of national hunt racing. I just remember all his quotes about hurdling. You're absolutely right, let alone the flat. I remember he had a horse called Tiernin, who was actually a really good hurdler, but he thought it was a waste of time before he went over fences. So I loved his horses, but he made me laugh, if I'm honest, with the quotes he used to come out with, which if you said them now on television, if you said things he said on racing TV, you'd be taken off air, Nick, honestly. And you've got to remember, he fought a very brave battle as well. I talked about Bob Champion earlier, but Captain Forster fought a very brave battle against illness and never, ever spoke about it. And he must have suffered an awful lot. And yeah, he was a big hero of mine.
John Sumner was the owner who passed away a few years ago, and there was I think Brendan Powell paid tribute to him, of course, the regular rider of Dublin Flyer, and partnered him to all those great wins. And he talked about Captain Tim Forster and what it was like at the time, and how the trainer didn't want to be rewarding the jockey sort of just around the back or whatever. And I think it was a case of the owner, John Sumner, going to Brendan Powell, slipping him an envelope saying, well done, but with a note attached saying, whatever you do, please don't tell the captain. And that's kind of what it was all about, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I've loved hearing those stories because obviously, as I say, I'd never met him, but a lot of the guys I work with now obviously work with him. Luke Harvey being another one, as well as Carl and Brendan. And it's fun because every time Analog's daughter it is on social media, on Twitter, isn't it, who posts the old pictures. And every time he posts a picture of Dublin Flyer, I tend to get in touch with Brendan Powell and say, oh, my absolute favourite. And they've got some stories to tell, most of which the time at his yard would have to go out after the watershed, I think.
I think there's a few from that era. We will move on to another of his most famous horses of the 1990s, and at Cheltenham, the success of Martha's Son.
But it's Viking Flagship who raises the game under Richard Dunwoody coming round the final turn. Two in second place, Ask Tom. Back in third is Martha's Son. So Viking Flagship, can he win his race yet again? Martha's Son is putting in a big finish. This is the last. Martha's Son touches down in the lead. Viking Flagship. Ask Tom, giant strides the outside. But it's Martha's Son who battles his way up the hill. And it's Martha's Son for Tim Forster and Rodney Farron in the Queen Mother Champion Chase. It's going to go to Martha's Son at the line. Martha's Son is the winner. Two in second place, Ask Tom. Third is Viking Flagship. Fourth home came Clara Davis. And then Strong Promise, who was a bit disappointed.
Pretty extraordinary, considering that was just about Martha's Son's first race, or first completed race, in about 16 months or so. Now, we'll come to the horse, but that was quite a significant race for you professionally, wasn't it, Ed?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because I had got on that BHB course. I was thinking I was going to live the dream. I thought I was going to be sent to what I wanted to do, which was racecourse management. So I was hoping I'd go to Ascot or Goodwood or the United Racecourses as they were in the mid-90s. I got sent to Ladbrokes for my work experience, which at the time I thought was an absolute disaster. And I had to be there for 2 weeks, and then I'd go and do a normal job. But I absolutely loved it. I was there for 3.5 years. And Martha's Son came early in that journey. I started, obviously, with work experience in the shops and that type of thing. But very quickly, I was very lucky because a vacancy became available in the odds compiling department. There were 3 of them, and they wanted a 4th. And I was probably very inexpensive and ended up getting the job. And I wasn't very good, and the learning curve was very steep. And it used to be terrifying, honestly, genuinely terrifying. What used to be called the call over, where you'd price up a race and then call over your prices. And I'd always be terrified of going first and being made to look a fool, because if I went, whatever the horse was called, 10-1, and then the other 3 were 6-4, I'd look like an absolute clown. And then everything else, my percentages would be out and so on. And in that odds compiling department was John Thompson, who was the boss and a real hero of mine. He taught me most of the things I know about racing. A guy called Tony McGinn, and a guy you'll know, John O'Connell, was the other odds compiler. And I needed to earn their respect quite early. And we used to take a view in those days because there was no internet and that type of thing, Ladbrokes with a magic sign and so on. And I persuaded them, I don't know how, that Martha's Son was going to win the Queen Mother Champion Chase. So we were what's called ducking him for a long time. And then in his prep, he went to Kempton and fell, having not run for a very long time. And the others said, there you go, the dream's over, because he used to jump very low and flat, Martha's Son, a complete contrast to Dublin Flyer, who winged his fences. Martha's Son, I mean, literally, it must have been exhilarating but terrifying ride for Rodney Farron. But I kept the faith, because Captain Forster, the more pessimistic he was, the better the chance the horse had. if you think of his Grand National winners, the Anne Duchess of Westminster horse, Last Suspect, wasn't it? He said to her, let's meet behind the stand when they found him. So when he was pessimistic, that sort of meant he was confident. He was so pessimistic about Martha's Son, which increased my confidence. So I persuaded the odds compilers at Ladbrokes to keep ducking him. So we actually did all right of it. And that sort of was the day when he won the Queen Mother Champion Chase that established me, I think, as an odds compiler. But I was never very good, if truth be told.
I think we saw Strong Promise made a bit of a mistake, the young horse, but there you can see him. And I think that was the fear. I think Tim Forster said after the race that he didn't think the horse would get round at all. I think he was quite emotional, and rightly so. But for you to be taking a position at that point with a race of the magnitude of the Queen Mother Champion Chase, would you have been quite nervous at a young age that you'd suck your neck out? And obviously it was vindicated, but would you be quite nervous in the build-up to the race?
We can't pretend I got it right very often, so this was a rare occasion when I got it right. Yeah, I'd be terrified. I'd always be terrified at what we call the call-over for the prices for the race, let alone when you look to the field books. You'd have your computer, which would show the liabilities on each horse in the race. I don't know what they do now, if I'm honest, but then it was a big thing. And when you saw Viking Flagship there on the far side, he would have been the big liability at the time. He was such a popular horse. So my neck was on the line, and jumping the last, you didn't think many horses without Battle Viking Flagship. And ask Tom, look at the size of him as well. And then little old Martha's Son came between the two. So you can imagine, I remember I was in the office and trying to stay cool, but that was impossible. That was a huge moment for me in my career.
Early 20s, that's the first race we've had from the Cheltenham Festival among the four. We've talked, obviously, at length about the Grand National, and we'll talk about the Cheltenham Festival now. In terms of where you were at that stage of your life, what was your relationship like with the Cheltenham Festival? You said you were in the office, but would it have otherwise have been a bit of a pilgrimage for you?
Oh, yeah, I loved it. I didn't go. In my 3 years at Ladbrokes, never got the chance to go because it was all hands to the pump. I'm sure it's the same now, to be honest. It's even bigger now than it was then. And we didn't bet on that many races. Anti-post wasn't a big thing. We probably bet on the big three, maybe, or the big four on the 3 days. There was no betting on many of the other races until the 5-day stage at the earliest. But in terms of turnover, it was a monster. Not on the same level of the Grand National, obviously, but an absolute monster, a huge 3 days in any bookmaker's calendar. And it was a real adrenaline rush. I'd never seen anything like it. Because you can imagine, I had no interest before going to Ladbrokes to be involved in bookmaking or odds compiling. It's complete accident and luck, really. And the Cheltenham Festival was absolutely huge. But no, I wasn't going. It was just 3 days ringed in the calendar as big ones for work.
Right, on the topic of work, the next horse that we show in a moment or two's time is some time after, much more recent, the three that we'll see at the end. At that stage, 1997, odds compiler for Ladbrokes, on the way in that career. But then 1999, it all changed, Sky Sports. Just tell us about how it changed at that point and then the years afterwards before we eventually come on to talking about horses much more recently.
So the 1999 Cricket World Cup was a big turning point in my life because I became the cricket odds compiler in that anti-post department with Roger Tull and Brad Barry, who became great friends at the time as well. I'm still in touch with Brad now, absolute legends. And I was the sole cricket odds compiler by then, and I messed it up completely. A famous, an infamous match between Pakistan and Bangladesh, I got horribly wrong. And you can imagine what happened. I was top price Bangladesh, who miraculously won the game, and you didn't know the damage done with no real internet until probably the following Monday when a pile of betting slips would arrive on your desk. And the pile on my desk, the Bangladesh ones were up here, little yellow slips that still haunt me now, and Pakistan was down here. And we'd had a bit of a disaster in cricket terms, and that was pretty much the end of my cricket odds compiling career for sure. And to be honest, I was ready to go and do something else. And I started up a company called Sports Advisor, which a few of your viewers might remember. We were a sports betting magazine and an internet site with spread betting advice in it. And I quickly became the editor, and we had Eddie Fremantle. The Shoe wrote a column. Mm-hmm. Julian Wilson used to be the high roller, and Mark Winstanley, the low roller. Nigel Shields used to write in it. So overnight, I went from being an odds compiler to an editor of a magazine. So that was a baptism of fire. And I used to go on every Friday, Bloomberg Television in the city, because, as I say, spread betting was a big part of the magazine. And I used to go on Bloomberg TV every Friday morning talking absolute nonsense with the likes of Alan Alger and other bookies PR guys who are still around now. It was great fun. But I was very lucky, and this is what you need, if I'm honest, in television. You need any eyeballs that see you. You just need a bit of luck. And I was lucky to have been seen by one of the senior guys at Sky called Andy Melvin. And he got me into Sky and said, we'd like to have a look at you. And of course, I thought I was a great journalist at that time, editing this magazine. I thought, I don't want to work in TV. So I went there thinking it was a completely free hit. He ended up offering me a job working with Kirsty Gallagher and Matt Lorenzo on a Friday night, a show called 90 Minutes, I think it was called. It's called The Sports Centre, then became 90 Minutes. And I did a number of shows at Sky, all of which were an absolute disaster to start with. Kirsty left to go and do Rise on Channel 4, and the Sports Centre died. Then I did the full FP with Jess Stelling for one season, I think, and that died. And I thought, television's not going to work. The magazine had gone bust. And I was known as the Grim Reaper at Sky because I kept doing these shows that didn't survive. And I thought, what on earth am I going to do now? But thankfully, one of the biggest influences on my career is a guy called Andy Cairns, who offered me a job on Sky Sports News, thinking I was reading autocue on these shows, which I wasn't. So when I had my screen test, as they're called, which a lot of people like yourself will know about, I was hopeless because I couldn't read autocue. And he said, we're really disappointed. We thought you were going to be quite good. And I said, well, I've never done anything like that before in my life. So I had some intense autocue training. And then I was on to Sky Sports News, reading the news. My first shift, I remember, on a Sunday evening after I'd been at a wedding. And I was off and running in television at that point and got lucky from there, really.
So as you progressed over a decade and a bit at Sky Sports, eventually hosting Super Sunday and Monday Night Football, some of the prime-time big football slots, where is horse racing at this point? Is it just when you have the time, because presumably you work weekends, when you have the time, you just get to tune in as and when, pop along to the races? It's still a bit of an enthusiasm, but obviously not to the extent of where it was.
It was literally just a hobby because football is all-consuming. And very quickly I was presenting the midweek soccer specials, and I often say that I'm responsible for Jeff Stelling's success because I was so bad at it. I showed how good he was at it. So he's got a lot to thank me for. And that then spiraled, and I was ill for a year, so I missed a year, and racing played a big part in that little journey. Yeah. But when I came back, my life changed overnight when Richard Keys and Andy Gray left Sky. That big job became available, and they called it Presenter Idol. It was all over the papers. I was 14-1 to get the job, the outsider. I remember Lineker was the favourite, Ben Shepherd second in, Dave Jones, all sorts of others. I was 14-1, and they gave me a chance. Fulham Newcastle at Craven Cottage on a Tuesday night was my first game. It was terrible, really, really terrible. I thought, well, they've given me a go. They're very kind of them. It's not going to work out, but they gave me another one. And my third game was the Manchester Derby with the Rooney overhead kick. And I had a row with Mike Summerby that day because he told me that Man City were the dominant team, and you have a look at your stats, they were dominant. And I very politely said in my slightly understated way, well, actually, Mike, when we look at this, Man United have bossed the stats in every department. He flew off the handle, and I fought back, and Sky thought, crikey, he's got a bit about him. And then my game started to improve, and then must have been, crikey, Cheltenham time almost. I did used to go to Cheltenham in all my time at Sky because it was always a Champions League week, so I'd always escape to Cheltenham. So you can see it was a hobby, and I was going occasionally. And they then said, we want you to do the big job with Super Sunday and Monday Night Football. And that was the good news. The bad news followed pretty quickly afterwards, where they told me I was going to be working with Gary Neville, which at the time felt like a disaster.
As we move on then and switch back to Ed's favourite horses, we pick up one of the most famous horses of recent times, the legendary Many Clouds.
2 out, Many Clouds over in front from Shut the Front Door and Centauri were chasing. Royal Knight took it in fourth, then Oscar Time followed by Monbeg Dude, Solid Alvarado, and it's Many Clouds in the colours of Trevor Hemmings who will lead at the final fence in the National. Lands 3 lengths clear. St R chases him off towards the elbow. Shut the Front Door back in third and now looking one paced. Monbeg Dude is staying on in fourth, then Royal Knight and Alvarado just over a furlong to go in the National. Many Clouds and Leighton Aspel 4, maybe 5 lengths ahead of St R. Monbeg Dude is still staying on stoutly, has moved into third and then Shut the Front Door. Many Clouds, St R is trying to get on terms, cutting him back near the line. Many Clouds clinging on tenaciously from St R in the colours of Trevor Hemmings. It's Many Clouds who wins the Crabbies Grand National. Leighton Aspel again, this time for Oliver Sherwood. St R is second, Monbeg Dude is third. Alvarado.
What a brilliant and courageous horse, Many Clouds, winning the Grand National 5 years ago, scarcely believable in the sunshine, and back-to-back wins for Leighton Aspel after Pinot de Rey a year before. Why did Many Clouds make the list, Ed?
Well, listen, he was a great horse, and one person I've grown to love in this job is owner Trevor Hemmings. What a man he is. Summed up at this year's Grand National launch, actually, when we had some deaf children who were going to sign alongside Laura Wright. And I just happened to say they were there. And then when Sir Anthony arrived, I took him to go and meet the kids. And guess who was in there, chatting away to all the teachers and signing with the kids? Trevor Hemmings, just off his own back, and just shows what an awesome, lovely man he is. And he's just been awesome for the sport. So love the owner. Oliver Sherwood's obviously a great guy, and the horse captured everyone's imagination. But for me, Nick, the reason he's in here is because that's the one day when he passed away that still haunts me to this day, because it was only the 4th show we ever did on ITV, and I'd had a baptism of fire in the job anyway, going from football to racing, and the way day one turned out at Cheltenham. And then in just our 4th show, everything was building to this wonderful crescendo at Cheltenham. I don't know whether you remember that day, but the Ascot had been abandoned and the races had been switched over, and Undersow had just won. What would it have been? The Clarence House, maybe?
Yep.
And the whole place was building to a crescendo. It was amazing. And I was thinking, racing's the best thing ever. This is the best move I've ever made. I'm loving it. And then we had that great finish up the hill with Thistlecrack. And you can imagine what I was thinking. And then suddenly the balloon wasn't just pricked. I mean, it was just horrendous. And I'd never experienced anything like it. I'd never presented racing before. I'd never had to experience anything like that in my life. The closest awful thing I had to present, I suppose, was when an hour before a game at Anfield, I was told that Gary Speed had passed away. And that was hard to deal with. But again, completely and utterly different. And my legs were literally going like this under the table, thinking, right, you've got to get the tone right. What happens here? I was so upset, nervous, trying to handle it right. And I had some very good people around me, production team and guests and so on. And it was really difficult. I'm not going to lie, it was really difficult. And the thing I remember that day is that Oliver Sherwood, we said to him, please come on. The sport needs you to come on ITV here because this isn't great. And what a service he did to the sport. I think the 2 great racing interviews I've ever heard, John Gosden after the tragic King George and Oliver Sherwood after we lost Many Clouds. He changed the game. He did the sport such a good service. And he got us remembering what an awesome horse Many Clouds was, how he loved what he did and the sport. And, I've loved Many Clouds ever since then so much. I mean, CJ looked after him, gave me some cufflinks, Hemmings cufflinks, which I treasure now, and I wear them on big days. Grand National Day, I always wear those cufflinks. And Many Clouds, even though I wasn't really part of his journey before then, because I was working in football, obviously, but he's got a very special place in my heart now. And I hope we did him justice on that day, because, as you say, he was an absolute hero of a horse.
He was. In terms of that first month for ITV, January 2017, with the first day, New Year's Day, which was an absolute monsoon, and obviously a cold one at that, being January the 1st, and then abandonment to Ascot, that happening, of course, at Cheltenham at the end of the month. Did you personally feel like it was a bit of a baptism of fire?
I think that's quite an understatement. I had no idea what I was in for. I'd left Sky in a bit of a hurry after Leicester had won the Premier League and tried to immerse myself in racing. I thought I needed to know everything, having worked for 17, 18, 19 years in football. And I wanted to see everything. I went everywhere from Coolmore and Ballydoyle to smaller yards in the north, the breeding operations and all sorts. I felt I needed to know everything. It was such an error in hindsight, Nick. I didn't need to. I love being the person who can ask the stupid questions, if you like, and trying to get the best out of other people. But I got myself in a right stew before January the 1st. And then in that monsoon, I lost everything. The best thing that could happen to me, really. I lost all my notes. I'd made reams of notes. I'm a furious preparer. And I had my iPad and I had all my notes and I had a head full of scrambled egg, really. And they were all washed away. Paper was no use because I had nothing waterproof. My iPad stopped working. So I was totally in the dark, which did me a favour, really. I learned a lesson from it because sometimes as a presenter, ignorance is bliss. Warmth and likability, I suppose, are the most important factors of any presenter. As soon as you as a presenter start informing people at home of anything, then to me, you're gone at the game. Your job is to be the referee, the quarterback, steering things gently. Hopefully people don't notice you, getting the best out of other people. My problem that day was I had Sir Anthony McCoy, who, as you know, is grumpy at the best of times. But when it's wet, he's miserable. And when it's cold, he's extra, extra miserable. So you can imagine what he was like on his first day on ITV. We had Luke Harvey, who said, this is my dream job, but I don't think I can do it anymore. And he was pretty much crying. Cameras weren't working, water in the system, everything was going wrong. The critics the next day, rightly probably, absolutely slaughtered me, slaughtered ITV. In the Times, I was described as about as exciting as a self-assembly chest of drawers from IKEA. And you need thick skin at that point. Social media was just absolutely brutal. But, I was used to that. That didn't faze me one iota. I had my plans, and I rallied the team and said, listen, let's read everything, listen to everything, let's try and prove people wrong. And that was the first day of a very long journey. And Brits don't like change. People make their minds up very quickly, but hopefully since then we've proved lots of people wrong, which has been quite fun. And just for a few weeks, as you said, that first month, with the reaction to our coverage, we were trying to be different. We had to be different. And then what happened with Many Clouds, it was really, really difficult. And as Sir Anthony said on television, Ed, what have you done? You used to work in a cosy studio with Souness, Redknapp, Carragher and Neville. And now here you are out in the cold in this mad sport. But I never doubted it. I never for a minute have I looked back and thought I made a mistake.
With that list of names, I think I'd prefer the cold. Right, we'll move on and pick out one of Ed's favourite horses of recent times. And he is Tiger Roll.
They get to the second last in the Randox Health Grand National. Magic of Light and Tiger Roll is poised on her girth. Rathvinden is in third place. It is in fourth position, then Walk in the Mill as Tiger Roll out jumps Magic of Light at the last. Rathvinden is in third place, and it is Tiger Roll who now takes the advantage, coming to the elbow from in second position. Magic of Light, Rathvinden, one for Arthur, staying on into fourth. It's been 45 years, and now Davy Russell shakes up Tiger Roll. Magic of Light in second, Rathvinden in third, Walk in the Mill is back in fourth. Tiger Roll is remarkable. He comes up towards the winning line under Davy Russell to win his second Randox Health Grand National. Tiger Roll joins the greats and beats Magic of Light, a massive run in second. Rathvinden third, clear of Walk in the Mill.
What a little gem. Back-to-back wins in the Grand National for Davy Russell, Gordon Elliott and the horse Tiger Roll in the colours of Jiggins House Stud. And he's just had the most remarkable career, hasn't he? That's 5 years after a Triumph Hurdle. He comes back, he wins a 4-miler, a couple of cross-country chases, Grand Nationals. He's just extraordinary, Ed.
It's bonkers, isn't it? Makes no sense whatsoever. And the debate will rage on with Red Rum and so on. But it's pointless, really. They're both absolute Aintree legends. And yes, Red Rum probably is a better horse, and it was a different race in his day and so on. But Red Rum did nothing like what Tiger Roll has done away from Aintree. I mean, that CV is utterly, utterly bonkers. To win a Triumph Hurdle over 2 miles over hurdles, to then win a National Hunt Chase over 4, I mean, that's crazy in itself. But then to win 2 cross countries, I mean, doesn't make any sense at all. And I just love him. He's been such a big part of my journey in racing. I've got so much to thank him for. And in sport, I've always liked the underdog. I've always liked the diminutive one, I suppose. As a Southampton fan, everyone loves Alan Bald. He was just small and a legend, taking on the big guns in the World Cup and for us. And Tiger's a bit like that. He's Diddy, really. And look at him here, swinging away. I mean, honestly, this brings a tear to my eye watching this. You say horses are dudes. There's no bigger dude than this guy, and everyone knows how much I love him. And this office I'm in now, if the banner wasn't behind me here, this is a shrine to Letizier, Southampton, and the horse you're seeing now, Tiger Roll. In auctions, I think there are more Tiger Roll saddlecloths than Usain Bolt spikes that people buy in auctions from the London Olympics. They keep popping up, and I think I'm meant to have the only one of those, but I've got paintings and all sorts of the Tiger. I just absolutely love him.
From a broadcaster's perspective, and I'm not talking about necessarily yourself, but the whole of the team at ITV and indeed in television in general, how much pleasure do you get in getting hold of a story like Tiger Roll can give you and going forward with it and having a narrative like that?
It's more the fact it's really important for the sport, because you need the sport to resonate with people at home. You know, my mantra with ITV has always been to make racing accessible to all, which is very difficult. You need thick skin to do it, because a lot of people in racing and with social media now don't like that. And I've got a choice. Either I pander to that and broadcast differently to suit them, to a very narrow band, or I try and broaden it and be brave. And that's what we've tried to do. But in order to do that, you need horses to help. And how lucky have we been, and I been, to have a horse we'll talk about in a minute, but also this horse, Tiger Roll, because he resonates with people at home. The racing audience itself is tiny in relative terms, Nick. It really is. While Tiger Roll, you can do that. So in both the years, the stick I've taken for coming up with mad ideas with Tiger Roll and said, listen, why don't we ask people to dress up like Tiger Roll at home? Let's do a thing called race card charades with Tiger Roll for youngsters. Act out your best charade. And people go, oh, God, typical Ed, typical ITV. What a waste of time. But it's so important. That's why I've had to hold firm a number of times, because we've had kids rolling in various corridors. We've had bread rolls. When we did it, one guy was hedge hunter and literally launched himself off a ladder into a hedge. I still don't know to this day if he's okay. But these things are so important to increase racing's popularity and get it to resonate with people at home. And horses do it better than anything. And Tiger Roll has captured people's imagination. We're deluding ourselves. If you think you go on the high street now, Nick, and say, have you heard of Pinatubo to people? Not a chance. Not a chance, even though we in racing think of Pinatubo as a great 2-year-old. But with Tiger Roll, you've got a chance. People might know Frankie. They might know Sir Anthony McCoy. They probably know Lester Piggott. And they'll know Tiger Roll. And that's the power of Tiger Roll and how lucky I've been. And the sadness, it's not sad relatively with what's going on in the world and all the heroic frontline and key workers at the moment. But for racing, it's so sad that Tiger wasn't able to do his thing this year, because it would have been the biggest racing story for decades. No question about it. And for the sport, we need to understand how big and important he has been.
Absolutely right. The final horse of the Super 7, this special lady, she doesn't need too much of an introduction.
And it's Pocket Full of Dreams by 5 lengths. 2 in second, Sabetsu. Then Enable in the pink cap. Rhododendron going well towards the outside. The leader folding up and coming back to them now, about to be swallowed down by Sabetsu, by Enable and Rhododendron. And it's Enable and Rhododendron battling on here. Enable and Frankie Dettori in the pink cap. Rhododendron and Ryan Moore in the dark blue jacket. Chased by Alluringly back in third. Both riders going for everything. And Enable is just getting on top from Rhododendron. Inside the final furlong, Enable kicks 2 lengths clear of the favourite and racing up towards the line. Enable for a 4th Oaks win for Frankie Dettori in the colours of Khalid Abdullah, and Enable wins the Oaks. Pulling well clear in the end from Rhododendron, Alluringly third, and Horseplay staying.
He talks about monsoons at Cheltenham. I think you needed an arc that day. Your first Oaks in terms of presenting at Epsom, the year that Enable won it back in 2017. She's been an ever-present as well in your time as presenter at ITV, I suppose. A bit like a jumps horse, but much more rare when it comes to the top quality horses on the flat.
Again, that's why I've included her, Nick. I owe such a debt of gratitude to the horse, to everyone who's involved with her, the team around her, and the owners, the sporting owners. To think that we're going to see her again, touch wood, this summer is incredible. And she has just been, for me and ITV, huge. Likewise for you guys at Racing TV, because people want to see Enable. And that day, what a dramatic day that was from the start, with delayed aeroplanes. And then do you remember Olivier Pellier bailing out? Cameras were going down. Bruff Scott was saying, I don't think they can race this in an electrical storm. But off they went, and she caused a storm. And we didn't really know just how good she was going to be, even at that stage. She was late on the scene, really. Chester, and then that, and then she just took off. And she's been brilliant for us. And to think that she's still in training is so big for the sport. And she will be an absolute gem for us this summer again, because just like Tiger Roll, she resonates. And she's got a man on board who most definitely resonates. And that has just been the perfect partnership for us. And with those big ears, she's impossible not to love, isn't she? And she's been a superstar.
Do you get an extra buzz when you go to the races knowing that she's there?
Yeah, definitely, because the racecourse is buzzing. And if you ask me the racecourse I enjoy presenting at most, that's probably it, actually, what we just saw there at Epsom. That's the closest you get. Sorry to say this to an Arsenal fan, but to Anfield and the old-fashioned grounds, if you like. White Hart Lane used to be like that, sorry again. But what I mean about that is it's so intense, Epsom. You're presenting with the track down the middle and then just people and buses and fairground everywhere. It creates the most intense atmosphere. It's like a cauldron, like an old-fashioned football ground. And to have her at Epsom as well on that day, obviously she wasn't quite in the public conscience as she has been since, was very special. I love presenting at Epsom, and other days, King George days, and I haven't been at an ARC when she's been there, but I presented ARCs from back in London, and you get a buzz from that. And when she is there, she creates an extra buzz herself. She really does. And Racing have done it well. GBR have done it well with the paddles and Enable, and she's captured people's imagination. And I can't tell you just how important that man on board is for a terrestrial television audience. I was asked the other day for the most influential person in racing, and my answer was the Queen. And my goodness, we'll miss her when she's gone, because what she's done for racing, you cannot even begin to describe or appreciate. But Frankie Dettori is not far behind, to be honest, the good he's done for the sport. And Frankie, turning 50 soon, please keep going for as long as you possibly can, because you are a gem. You are an absolute diamond for this sport. And put together with Enable, that combination is just absolute dynamite for us.
we will now round off with Ed has already talked about Frankie Dettori, but he'll introduce another jockey who's very much illuminated his life. But first up, it'll be the trainer. We've mentioned him already, and a bit of a hero of yours, Ed, in the 1990s, Captain Tim Forster. You said you didn't meet him, but presumably a bit of an idol from afar.
Yeah, absolutely. As a trainer, as a man, I mean, a scurrilous man as well. Go and read his quotes. Go and read his quotes. Poor old Miriam Franken one day was on the receiving end, but it was all tongue-in-cheek. You couldn't say it now, but what a character. And I've loved hearing the stories that we talked about from the jockeys, what he was like. A real old-school military disciplinarian with a sensational sense of humour and trained at the time my type of horses. The flat was a waste of time for him. Hurdling was a bit of a waste of time as well. And his horses were all big, a lot of them homebred, chasing types. And in those days, you could run up sequences. And you go back and look at Coonawarra, for example, a horse that ran up the most ridiculous sequence before the Arkle. Martha's Son did similar. And the list just goes on. Marmur, General Wolf, Step on Air, Tiernan, obviously Dublin Flyer. And the fact they're behind me there shows the place in my heart. And what a man. I've loved reading about him. I've loved the bravery against illness, which he made no fuss about whatsoever. An absolute hero.
This quote, I think, is probably one you were referring to, and I think we've alluded already, but he did say, one day I'm going to stand for Parliament, and if I get in, my first bill will be to abolish flat racing, and my second to do away with hurdles. So I think it might raise a few eyebrows, to say the least. And others as well. Ben Nevis, when he won the Grand National, the jockey's instructions, keep remounting. And Henry Daly is full of wonderful stories about him as well. Right, the final person in our list is the jockey, and it's someone that's very close indeed to Ed Chamberlin, has been for a couple of decades or so. Sir Anthony McCoy, seen there winning the Grand National on Don't Push It back in 2010, 10 years ago, but it was quite a party afterwards, wasn't
it? Yeah, he'll hate me for doing this, because as you've seen on television, he's never nice to me, and I try not to be nice to him either, but he's such a good guy, honestly, and everyone knows that, to be fair. And he's also the most generous man you'll ever wish to meet, and his party after the Grand National summed him up. It was one of the best parties I've ever been to, and you'd have liked it, Nick. They showed the Champions League final on screens. There was a sort of casino section. Anything you wanted was there. You even got a golf buggy back to your car. It was textbook McCoy, if you like, generous to a fault. All he cared about was other people having a good time. And the reason I put him in here is not only is he the greatest jockey of all time, Gary Neville, who I learnt a lot from. Neville and Carragher have been huge influences on my life. And Gary would always say in sport, nice people don't win. At Man United, he was horrible, they were horrible. You know, if you didn't go down for a penalty, Sir Alex Ferguson would tear strips off you. And he said, nice people get nowhere, Ed. Well, this guy you're seeing now, and what a ride that was, by the way, synchronised. Best of the lot for me, even better than Wichita Lineman. He's proof that nice guys do win, because he's much nicer than people think. When I first met him, I didn't like him much. He was an absolute lunatic who beat himself up the entire time, but he's mellowed since then. And you don't get to see often what he does. I've learned as a trustee at the Injured Jockeys Fund just what he does. The amount of time he spends on the phone, looking after people, looking out for people, generous to a fault, always willing to give his time. Have you ever seen him turn down a selfie, an autograph? Have you ever seen him say, on social media, if someone asks him to do something, he'll do it? He's supported me like you wouldn't believe. No one would know, but when I was ill, he donated. It was at Plumpton, wasn't it, when he rode winner number 3,000?
Yes.
He immediately donated all the money from that day to my cancer fight. I mean, imagine what that meant to me in hospital at the time. And things he's done since. He'd never missed my Well Child Golf Day, for example. He'll hate me for saying this, Nick, honestly, but people need to understand, not only is he a sensational, greatest jockey you'll ever see, but he's also one of the best people, one of the best human beings as well.
Lovely words on Sir Anthony McCoy. Right, final 40 seconds. And hopefully we'll have terrestrial racing back as soon as possible. And we'll be, moving on into the Guineas and the Derby, and then hopefully this will all be a bit of a thing of the past. But for the time being, how much have you enjoyed looking back, just in a few words?
Loved it. Absolutely loved it. I'm an emotional mess, but I love reminiscing. It's been great fun. It's a good show, this. I hope you do lots more.
Very much so. Ed, thank you very much indeed. We'll have football back for you as well, and Southampton can go and avoid the drop or whatever else is going on with them. And hopefully we'll have a classic or two around the corner as well. Thanks to Ed for being the latest guest on My Racing Life. We'll see you soon.